I'd like to start with your perspective, gentlemen, on what we've learned in the last 18 months as cyber attacks have escalated and evolved. Perhaps we'll start with you, Alex. Do the statistics that I just presented around the rising frequency of attacks surprise you? And how are these attacks changing?
Hey, Andy, great to be here. Good morning, everyone. I've been in cyber for about 20 years. And if somebody said to me 3 years ago that I'd be worried about ransomware, I would go, nah, that's never going to happen. Because at the time, 3 years ago, we were talking about the federal bank heist from Bangladesh, these highly skilled threats, right? Highly targeted threats. And ransomware really was a nuisance. And the way to prevent it was also very simple. You block your email, you have a really good email gateway, you're 80% there. But today, beyond the frequency, the volume of the attacks, we're seeing some real changes in the market, right? In the ransomware market. One is that there's a very clear professionalization. By professionalization, I don't mean the skill levels are getting higher. They're actually a little bit lower than some of the attacks that we're seeing. But there is a proliferation of marketing segments and processes and industry groups within their environment that are coming together and attacking your asset as an entire market-oriented force. What do I mean by that? There are people who are doing engineering. There are people who are doing the email crafting. There are people who are doing the social engineering. There are people who are basically selling their entire platform so other people can run in a franchise model to go after, right? So the skill level getting into the ransomware business is much, much lower. So that's the first one that's really surprising. And the other one is from Colonial, from GBS, which you talked about. We're also seeing people in the healthcare industry, hospitals that are being ransomware encrypted, and the attackers are absolutely ruthless. They don't even care that people are on the ventilator and they're going to die, and they will hold your ransom and get their Bitcoins back, right? So these are the things that are making the entire environment ruthless, much more efficient than before, and much more widespread. And these things that I didn't foresee 3 years ago, but we've seen that become a real problem these days.
Yeah, kind of scary, right? We've also got ransomware as a service, which is scary, and definitely we're seeing it hitting new industry or new verticals, something that we've not seen 4 or 5 years ago. The next one, I'll go to Stephen. What is incident response data telling us about how attacks have changed over the last 2 years, Stephen?
Yeah, hey Andy, thanks for having me as well. I'll kind of take from what Alex mentioned about this whole evolution of ransomware as a service economy, right? You've got affiliates, taking infrastructure and then passing that on. In the last couple of years, while we've been responding to incidences, of the 1,000 incidents that we've looked at worldwide, close to about 25% have been mostly ransomware incidents. So that gives you a sense of how much of ransomware incidences are getting affected, impacting customers, and they're actually spending time on that. Mannion also shares something globally called the M trends, right? Which is a dwell time statistic that usually gets used a lot by industries across the whole spectrum to kind of measure how attackers are evolving. If you look at it, the time that an attacker spends in the environment undetected, right, has continued to evolve. And if I compare that against Asia Pacific, Asia Pacific does have a much higher dwell time. So it's a little difficult for organizations here because they're not really planned to go look for the attackers. They're typically waiting for something to bubble up, and that's pretty late. Now the ransomware trends that we've seen, we found two very distinct type of threat actors. One, there are what I call a very sniper mode. So they're very targeted, get into the environment and then go after infrastructure that would give you leverage. In the past, we would have seen, as Alex said, right, wouldn't have really bothered you as much because it was more get in, just see what you can ransom. But now you see threat actors actually spending time trying to identify impact infrastructure that they could target. I'll leave you with two two very anecdotal stories that I, again from experiences, and I thought maybe the audience will also want to hear some experiences that we had. In one of these cases, we saw a threat actor group get in, get a foothold, and provide a set of tooling to another threat actor group, which then proceeded to actually perform, the ransomware operation. So, even the threat actors are realizing where that specialization is, and I see that continuing to increase. In 2020, I think we saw about 5 times more ransomware attacks than we did in 2018. So that's just giving you the trajectory of what you should be expecting in the future, right? Now, I've also seen organizations that have had multiple ransomware attacks. The first time around, they failed, they got impacted. It was what they called a black swan moment. But we've also seen organizations learn from that. And the second time they got impacted, much better prepared and with a reduced impact to the operation. So, there is a way to win that war on ransomware, and we're seeing organizations move towards that.
Scary indeed, Stephen, especially when bad actors now get together and start outsourcing that specialization, right? So there's a lot more that we need to do. All right, I'm going to move on to Brian. Brian, you've had a long and very interesting background in law enforcement. How are the motivations for these attacks changing? Who is behind them, and how serious are the outcomes of these attacks?
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and congratulations to Veritas for showing the leadership in this region, for putting this event on. It's highly important. I think I still remember sitting at my desk back in September 2013 when the first ransomware attacks. Now that's probably an insight starting to show my age and all this grey hair, but it was September. It was in the morning, and the phone started going off the hook, and I think we had 58 ransomware attacks hit Australia in the space of several hours, and there were 6 of them in Queensland at the time. And the criminals have continued to evolve in their methodologies, but fundamentally the motivation has always been very, very simple. It's about money. And whilst their methods have changed, you can see how they've got more greedier. We're going after the almighty dollar, and we've seen them, I'd say, operate at the tier 3 level, but in more recent times, certainly last 18 months, we've seen the tier 1 actors, threat actors, get up on board and really take hold. And at the moment, they're targeting those tier 1 enterprises. But I think Alex would probably agree that Proofpoint would start seeing more social engineering, more mass rollout, and we're going to go see the evolution of the tier 3 criminal going against the tier 3 target. So at the moment, we tend to hear about low volume, high value, but I think that's going to turn into low value, high volume. They won't jump away from those tier 1 enterprises. But this headache and this challenge is actually going to grow exponentially. And of course, we've seen them change to actually then not just encrypt data, but exfiltrate data, encrypt data, and you mentioned before, extortion, and they know how to use the dark web very effectively to bring more pressure onto boards and the like. But what really scares me in the future is, what if they say, we're going to encrypt all your data, we're going to cripple your operations, you won't cease to function, but we don't want money. We just want to cause harm and destruction. And that's a step that is absolutely frightening.
Definitely. And thank you, Brian. Now that we've heard about the learnings about resiliency, I'm now keen to now get your perspective, all 3 of you, on managing attacks. So back to Alex. From a security perspective, is prevention possible? And once an attack happens, what really should be done?
If you hire a security person, they say they can give you 100% security, fire them like right away, right?
Run away.
Yeah, right away. Because it's not possible, right? We're talking about the nexus of people, processes, technology, culture, and the attackers are adept at finding the holes in your defenses, regardless of what that defense is. So I think complete prevention is not possible. But with that said, 99% of organizations can do a much better job in managing their risk and lowering that risk. They can be much nimbler in defending against the risk and recovering from the risks, right? So I'll give you maybe 2 things around people, one thing around people, one thing about technology. So everything starts with people, right? It used to be people clicked on the email and then, somehow they got breached. And lately we're seeing RDP, basic reverse desktop, protocol, right? Accessing remote access protocols and VPNs becoming a whole. But you see, when you drill into it, that's not a technical problem. That's a people problem, right? Because if you have an old and vulnerable password for your VPN, people got in, that's not really a technical control. It's more people and process control issue inside an organization. So that's one thing we can look at. And then lastly, just from a technical response perspective, right? When they get in, Brian, both of Stephen and Brian talked about how the attackers are patient and they're methodical. They will go around finding the most critical assets, encrypting them before they send you the ransomware. What that means is you probably have a lot of process and technology holes in the organization that they can get to. They can understand your network better than you. And you may have very outdated stuff inside the system where they're taking advantage of, right? So the basic fundamentals, the elbow grease around security, that never goes away. And then I just want to comment on the recovery bit a little bit, right? When people get breached, they want to do recovery. And our experience is that if you don't have a plan to do the recovery, it's going to be very, very challenging. You don't know where critical assets are.
Right.
And the assets can be workloads, can be data, but if you don't have an overall organizational view around what's your crown jewel and where are they, and do you know how to recover them, and you have a drilled around recovering them, it's going to be very difficult because you need to do, this is what you need to do, right? You need to make sure your environment's clean before you start doing it.
Yep.
You need to rebuild servers, you need to refine your cloud keys and set up your credentials with Amazon, whatever it may be, find the databases, link the business back into IT, recover the data, and make sure everything runs and it's clean again. And that is not a trivial process. For usual organizations, that cost will be somewhere around $1 million, right? If not a whole lot more.
Great, thank you. And on the topic of recovery, Stephen, post-attack, what are the key steps to them, right? And can you truly ever fully recover?
Well, let me answer that. So yes, there are ways to recover, but what we've seen for organizations to go through, if they have a framework, it usually helps. The first thing that we always recommend is contain, right? I mean, the attackers in your environment, you don't have the attackers still active. They've just ransomware your environment. Will they continue to impact more? So that first step of containment is very important. If you actually look at the Colonial CEO's testimony, they were able to shut down the pipeline in 15 minutes from the time that they identified that there was a threat actor in the environment. And because they were able to do that, it allowed them to recover in a much more shorter period of time. If they hadn't contained, allowed the threat actor to move within the environment, the impact would have been much, much bigger. Post-containment, there's obviously remediate, restore, and recover, right? But to remediate, most organizations, kind of get into remediation without investigating. So they don't know what they're fixing. They're just getting the infrastructure back up again, operationally. And this is where we see the risk of reinfection. We've seen organizations get re-impacted purely because the attack is still in the environment. So we recommend to have that, that four-pronged process, right? You contain, you remediate, and then you go to rebuild and restore. And in that rebuild, back to what Alex mentioned, right? Rebuild securely is something that is not tried and tested. Now imagine you're, with the pandemic, you're working remotely, your network's offline. A lot of organizations have not thought about that. So, at this point, post-impact recovery is definitely very challenging. We are seeing organizations plan that, but this is something that, is possible. We have seen organizations recover, get back their business to operations. Most of the times, I would say, if they've not fortified their backups in advance, it takes away that option of recovery. So those would be some things that we would see as challenges. But again, there are ways to work around that.
Right. So what I hear is the 4 R's, right? Report, rebuild, restore, and remediate. Right. That's something easy to remember. And I'm gonna go to the favorite question, right? Or I guess that's pretty much on everybody's mind, right? Paying the ransom. Once done, is that the end of it, right? Is it ever a good idea? I'm going to go to Brian first, and this one I do want to hear from Alex and Stephen as well. So, Brian, over to you.
Yeah, look, I've been asked that question many times as a police officer by the media, should they pay the ransom? And I always said, as a law enforcement representative, I would never recommend paying the criminals a single cent. However, we have to be mature about this and approach it from a business decision. And if an organisation has not prepared, if doesn't have the backups in place and the strategies in order, and the support networks there that allow it to, say, go take a running jump cyber criminal, then they have to make that decision in the interest of the company. So it's not a black and white answer by any means. And whilst that, we've got to remember too that ransomware is an experience now. It's a legacy, and there's so many more elements to it. And it doesn't stop when you've paid the money, especially these days with data exfiltration, for example, as that they're bringing that into it. So we're seeing the extortion. And the other thing is we've got to remember is they're selling that data to hundreds, if not thousands of other cyber criminals. And we see data being exploited today that was compromised 10 years ago. And the one that really sticks in my mind as a great example recently is the ransomware attack and data exfiltration on a mental health clinic, a psychology clinic in Finland. Now, they then got the money from the ransomware attack. They wanted to sell the data back to the clinic. The clinic said, go away. They said, fine. Now they're pursuing individual patients, threatening if they don't pay a couple of €100 per client, they are now going to release the audio transcripts of their therapy sessions. And these people are suffering anyway. But the crooks don't give a flying fig. They just want their money, because that's what it's all about. And then you look at the litigation issues that will go. We'll see class action against organizations that lost that data. And of course, those people could come back for the next so many times and so many years down the track when every other criminal decides to exploit that sensitive information. So it is definitely a legacy. It's not a transaction, and there are long-term implications.
Right. I guess that answers that question, right? Once you pay it, it's never the end, right? So.
No.
Hey, Alex, I'm keen to also get a perspective, right? To pay or not to pay? Is it ever a good idea?
I also am conflicted about this, right? As a security professional, there's moral hazard in paying a ransom, because now you just made a lucrative trade even more lucrative, and they will attract more people. And then that symmetrical warfare, we're already at a disadvantage. It's just gonna get worse. With that said, I will also say that some of the recent views around outlawing paying ransom or in all of that, it's just too black and white. It doesn't fit in the natural world, right? Let's imagine you spend 20 years building a $500 million organization. You don't pay the ransom, you may very well go out of business, right? So is that a position that you really want people in a highly emotional state and they're under threat? The attackers basically got all your assets and all that it's preventing your customers being unserved and your business going out of line. They're preventing you from doing that. So I think there are situations where that should be considered at least, and that's why when you hear the FBI, for example, FBI is saying that we don't encourage you to pay the ransom, but even if you do agree to pay the ransom, work with us first, right? So we can give you the guidance and all that. And the last point that I want to draw parallel to is when you think about ransom in the physical world, it's not new. I mean, back in the Roman times, when you lose a war, the generals get kidnapped. They don't kill them, they treat them really well because they want the ransom, right? So that built kind of a process, almost like, this is what you expect when you get ransom. This is how much you pay. And we're seeing that from a pure economic market perspective, the cyber ransomware is getting to that state, right? You have the ransomware actors, you have the franchisees, you have all the platform players, and you also have the more fringe, great market people who claim that can get your data back and negotiate it on your behalf and all that, right? So what we're seeing is there is definitely a real world shades of gray kind of situation. You need to look at your business to see if that makes sense, right? Let me just do a little bit plug on your business, Andy. If you know where your critical assets are, you know where your data are, and you just test that last week, that gives you a bit of emotional stability when that ransomware note comes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to be always prepared as well. And I guess like what I'm also hearing is globally, whether it's the US, the UK, Singapore, closer to home in Singapore, Australia, the authorities hasn't really come out with something that's consistent across different markets, right? So this is still evolving, right? And finally, hey, Stephen, do you agree with what Brian and Alex has shared?
And I run a lot of these simulation exercises with execs, and typically when I get started, I ask them, "Would you pay ransom?" And then, overwhelmingly the answer is like 95% no. It's principle, we will never pay.
But we know that that's not
I take them through the exercise, and then
the
numbers
that are
about
reported, right?
60%, right? I mean, see, you eventually make that decision based on the leverage the attacker has. And if you look at, again, Brian and Alex have made some very, very valid points there. It's about financial payout, right? The attackers today are actually mining the data to let you know what they will release, to build that leverage, to facilitate a payment. Threat actors have chatbots now to make sure that you're getting responses. They will have the ability to negotiate. Now, obviously, they want to make sure that they get paid. I mean, what's the whole point going through a ransomware exercise? So they're trying to make it easier. If they don't give out the keys when they pay ransom, obviously, you don't look at that as anything that would you wouldn't really put a dollar over there. So we have seen, and we don't advocate paying, right? I mean, as someone in the security business, I would not advocate paying, because it at the end of the day is strengthening a very different economy that is very driven from getting these payouts. But if it's an existential crisis, right? You don't have backups, you're not planned for this, you're literally going out of business at that point in time. That's the only way to sustain, and businesses do make that conversation. Those are very emotional and difficult conversations that we see in the executive boardrooms when they need to eventually make that payment. A lot of times organizations haven't even figured out how they're going to pay, how they're going to transact. So while it's easy to say, yes, let's do that, how are you going to generate that amount of Bitcoin?
Right. Reality is they might not be in a position to make that decision, right? There's only got one choice, that is to pay, right? Okay. I think we can talk about this question forever, and I'm sure with the way it continues to evolve, this will change from time to time. We're now back to the last section, and this is when I'd like for all three of you to share key recommendations on how to mitigate the ongoing risk, right? So Alex, I'll start with you again, right? What do you advise your clients to focus on?
So I think in the tech industry, we're always being very, very focused, maybe a little bit myopically so, around the technology, right? And with working from home, the whole zero trust network stuff, and people are working in cafes, and to me, really the network edge has completely blended together, right? Yeah. It is blurred, right? The people are now the perimeter. So one is there's two interesting points to that. One is the people are the ultimate edge now. People are your asset, but also people are your biggest risk, because if you're a malicious insider, now you can do so much more damage. If you're an attacker that breached into an account, and now they're on the network, and there's nothing preventing you going horizontally scanning through the network, because we have to remember, VPN is a dumb tunnel, right? When you have a VPN, your attaches directly into the core critical assets in the company, in the data center, and there's not a whole lot of security control on that, right? These things start to make the user both the asset as well as the biggest threat, right? So we need to look at the ability to link the human behavior and understand how they're accessing workloads and data. When I think about a modern enterprise, I don't think of this in a server, database tier anymore. I think about workloads, and do you have the ability to recover workloads, and the data? Do you have the ability to recover the data when you can see that clearly there's a human risk that is attaching to either the workload or the data, right? So there's a lot of concepts in there. authentication, the whole ability to do privileged access management, all these things, they all link back together. In fact, I would venture to say, the root account in most companies is a source of evil. It's very difficult to understand what things are associated with the root account. So, but leave the technical controls aside. Focus on the people, train the people, have cyber education awareness, and just training people to be skeptical, right? If something looks kind of interesting or fishy, make sure that they are vigilant and bring that to the team that will continue to investigate. And then the last point that I want to talk about is it goes back to a lot of same topics we've talked about before, right? How many CIOs actually know where their assets are?
Yeah.
And have they tested a drill, do a fire drill on that? We do a fire drill in buildings, but we don't do fire drills around environments. And I think that testing and education pieces are really, really big going forward.
Got it. Thank you. So people, process, technology, typically weakest link people, focus on that. Got it. Stephen, from the advisory perspective, what recommendations do you encourage your clients to consider?
So I give you the 4 R's before. I'll give you the 3 P's now, right? So, see, it's prepare, practice, and premediate. And I'll talk about these very, very shortly. Prepare, right? Most of the times when you have these incidences, organizations haven't even had retainer or response contract set up in place, right? I mean, if you want to recover something, would you have someone on an SLA to be able to identify that really quickly and be able to then help you recover the infrastructure? If you don't have that, you're trying to figure that at a time that your organization is already crippled. Very, very challenging. So, do that preparation. The other preparations would be establishing containment and isolation plans. Again, going back to, what Veritas helps a lot of organizations is, build a DRP, recover, but also, build a containment and isolation plan so that you can contain certain key assets. And back to Alex's point, you can't contain everything, figure out what's really very critical, the crown jewels, and contain that first. The second is practice, right? You have to get this like a muscle. It has to become muscle memory. So, simulation exercises. There's actually a very upcoming business area right now called security validation, where they're actually testing real world techniques. So ransomware attacker techniques against your active environment to see, are you detecting that? Is it triggering? Right? And as you practice that, you're realizing that, well, I can deal with probably the 60 most common methods. I've not even looked at, some of these methods. So obviously I'm blind and I'm going to end up with, some sort of impact. I've actually had boards engage us to do what we call red team activities to go after backup infrastructure because they realize that backup is very, very important for sustainability of the business. But what if the attacker goes after the backup first before encrypting the rest of the infrastructure? So as you do these, practice exercises, you get to have a lot of good insight before having a ransomware. The last one is this term called premediate. I spoke about this at GovWare a couple of years back. Everyone talks about remediation. Remediation is typically after the fact. What can you premediate? What can you do before? Right? There's no point putting a CCTV camera post the crime. Right? You want to do it before. So what do you harden that makes it difficult for ransomware threat actors to move through the environment? Right? So AD hardening. I mean, we've seen threat actors typically get to identity, as Alex said, that's the perimeter, right? If they can get there, they can impersonate anyone, right? So get there. Second is fortify your backups, right? And I know you guys in Veritas do a pretty good job at that. There's a lot of security that's already shipping with the backup infrastructure. If you fortify that, you make it a lot more difficult for the attacker to take away your failsafe. And the third is, as Alex touched upon, this cloud configurations. As we're moving a lot to the cloud, you need to premediate some of that infrastructure to have visibility. If you do these 3 Ps, I will feel that you're in a much, much better position. I mean, like Alex said, you fire me if I said it's 100% security. You definitely are going to get in a much better place. You may have a breach, but the impact of that breach will definitely be manageable.
Got it. Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to also say the 3 Ps could be practice, 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 right? Exercise the muscle so it becomes muscle memory.
Absolutely.
All right. And now turning over to you, Brian, what recommendations do you have on mitigating the risk?
It's interesting. I read a recent interview with a Russian ransomware specialist, and they talked about how well and successful they've been since COVID by targeting the humans, the human factor, especially during the remote working requirement, and that's been very beneficial for them. And so I endorse what Stephen said, of course, and definitely Alex's point. But I take it a little bit further. Awareness is very good, and we've got to build the human dynamic into the solution equation and part of our defenses rather than just giving up on them, thinking we can solve everything with technology. We've got to embrace that human element, and we've got to me, migrate even further, evolve. We've got to make them aware, but also culturally adept, build the skills and build it in part of the organizational culture. And because there's a big difference between awareness and culture. And sadly, we've seen so many situations where people may be aware of what's the right thing to do, but they choose not to. When you've got it in your culture, they run with it every time. So I think we've got a long way to go, but
Brian, that's a sensational point. That's a sensational point. I watched a video before. It's by Ben Horowitz, a very famous business leader. He goes, the organization culture is like a new guy going to jail. You can talk about the rules and all that stuff, but if he knows who's got the knife in the jail and he needs to stay away from that guy, that's culture. You don't learn that from any of the manuals, but you will learn that in real world very quickly. And I think there is a little bit of security theater in many companies, right? There's a training, I take it, but there's no underlying behavior change.
Okay, good point. All right, hey, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Alex and Brian. It's been really fascinating talking to the three of you today. Alex and Stephen's going to be with us all the way to the end, so look forward to getting your insights as well for the Q&A. But what I'm going to do here is to summarize some of the key points and from what I've heard. Right, so it's very clear. Ransomware has evolved. Frequency and volume has increased significantly, especially over the last couple of years. Ransomware should no longer be viewed as malware, requiring victims to pay for access to their data. Data theft is leading to extortion, demands for money for not publicly releasing the data. Tier 1 criminal groups are now behind the attacks. We heard that. The outcomes can be serious with attacks on critical infrastructure, and sometimes on hospitals, and lives have been lost, right? We heard that as well. We also heard a ransomware incident does not end with the transaction. Data is continued to be released onto the dark web, which can then be exploited for many, many years to come. And paying only increases the likelihood of attacks, as attackers now have gained new motivation and they've got more money. And then the third one is there are 4 important steps in recovery: report, rebuild, restore, and remediate. And then we've also heard from Stephen, practice, 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 and the 3 Ps. And when it comes to putting together a risk mitigation plan, people should be front and center, because very often people are the weakest link, and people are the easiest target and very often the most vulnerable. So building a resilient culture is also critical because that sticks. And then also every business, so assume it is a target and plan from there. And organizations must also preempt incidents through strong network vigilance, hardened data backups, robust recovery measures, and strong encryption tools. Once again, Stephen, Brian, Alex, thanks for joining us. It was a great discussion. Wish we had more time with the 3 of you. And thanks again for sharing your precious time with us.